Good morning and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. As we all know, the Middle East is not doing well. There's a lot of violence, a lot of death. So we wanted to take this opportunity to talk about what we know. What's our perspective on what's going on and what are our hopes. And this morning, I'm joined by Daniel Borson and Ibrahim Hamide. I'm gonna let the panelists to introduce themselves. Start with Daniel.
Good morning, Ibrahim. So I'm Daniel Borson. I am Vice Chair of the Eugene Human Rights Commission. I am a Jewish American. I should start by saying that I have never been to Israel. And so my perspective mostly is as what Israel means in the American Jewish consciousness, and from a progressive Jewish perspective.
Thank you, Daniel. Eve?
Good morning, Ibrahim and Daniel and everyone else. My name is Ibrahim Hamide, and I'm also a Human Rights Commissioner for the city of Eugene. I was born and raised in Bethlehem, Palestine, the West Bank, near Jerusalem. So I immigrated here in 1969. I've been living here since. The Arab-Israeli conflict is dear and near to my heart for the obvious reasons, because I still have family in Bethlehem. I still own land in and near Bethlehem. So the conflict is dear and near for above the obvious reasons, but definitely for the obvious reasons. Today is the Nakba, which is the Palestinian catastrophe. It also coincides with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And it's also the third day of the Eid, which is the culmination of the fasting month of Ramadan for Muslims around the world. So it's a loaded occasion, not to mention what's going on, of course, the obvious, what's going on in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc. It's a scary moment. So thank you for convening us to speak about it.
Thank you, Eve. Like you said, Israel was created in 1948. So my first question is, what state was there? What was there before Israel was created?
Well, if I'm to answer that, obviously World War I ended up in Sykes-Picot Treaty, which the Allies divided the area in under that used to be under the Ottoman Empire rulership into between the French and the English. Palestine came under the English protectorship, so the English ruled it and protected it for a later decision where the area will be decided upon as far as government and land division between the Jewish immigrants and the Palestinian natives. So that's basically who had governed it. Jordan later on took over after 1948. And so when I was born, my birth certificate says I was born in Jordan. My brother, who's 2 years older, just to give you a personal notation on that, my brother, who's 2 years older, his birth certificate says he was born in Bethlehem, Palestine. So 2 years have changed ownership, basically. Mm-hmm.
Daniel, what motivated the choice of this specific area to create Israel?
Well, there is a historic and biblical connection to that part. Jerusalem was the site of the first and second temples. According to biblical text, that land, which historically was called Canaan or Canaan, was promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. And then Jerusalem has since become an important city to Christianity and then later to Islam as being a holy site. It's interesting to note that most major cities are on a major trade route or a waterway or close to agricultural, and Jerusalem is none of those. Really, the primary reason that Jerusalem is there is the assemblage of holy sites.
So my first question would be, lately we hear a lot about Hamas and Hamas launching rockets from Palestinian territory, and the Israel government bombarding the Palestine, and we have a lot of casualties. My question is, when did all of this started? How we got to from the creation of Israel to that ongoing war and battle, and in that picture, who are the settlers? Because we also hear a lot about settlers and who are there, and what is the attached to the territory they are in right now, and how to add to that, what is the Palestinian right on the land they are occupying right now?
Well, if again, if I was to tackle that question, and I'm happy to sort of bring it from the biblical perspective that Daniel mentioned to the current issues. The current issues are what's vital, though I think it's good to see them in a continuum view. But back in September of 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the Prime Minister of Israel, formally annexed or announced his intentions to annex a third of the occupied West Bank. Of course, tensions remained high ever since. And so there's no surprise that this sort of the cup has runneth over kind of explosion that is organic and natural that's happening right now as we speak in the territories. The Palestinians have had little rights. There's whether they're Palestinians from 1948 or ones that have been occupied since I was a 17-year-old boy living in that area when the Six-Day War occurred in 1967, where Bethlehem, my hometown, and Jerusalem came under Israeli occupation. And as, of course, a lot of Israelis see it, and I don't need to be a representative of that view per se, but they see it as the unification of the city of Jerusalem. So Israel and the settlers, as you mentioned, see it Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. The Palestinians also, as was mentioned by Daniel, they see the significance and they feel the significance of Jerusalem as a holy city to Muslims as well as Christians and Jews. So the settlers have, to me, as I view them, they're the tail that wags the dog in Israel. They're conservative. They have an agenda, and they beyond their agenda, they actually influence the state of Israel to enact laws that are discriminatory and oppressive laws to Palestinians. And I can mention some of those laws as time will allow, and I will state them as they are on the Israeli courts, the legal system of Israel. So therefore, to me, Israel has become a religious state, whether it wants to or not. So the settlers speak with a loud voice, though they're a minority in Israel, a 9 million people state, mostly secular, but the heart of Israel may be not so secular after all, because they have difficulty going up against the agenda of those small minority, aka as settlers. They believe themselves as they're not settlers, they're coming back home. So that, and again, I don't mean to put words in their mouth or anybody else's mouth for that matter, but to us, they are aggressive. They come in with a gun to Palestinians, for instance, living in Bethlehem or Jerusalem or elsewhere in the territory. They see two kinds of Jew, and they're both armed with guns, and they're coming to oppress them. One is a settler, the other is an Israeli soldier. They don't see the moral Jew, the one that stands with justice. And I know there are plenty of them, thank God. But the settlers are not interested in justice as secular people like you and I and Daniel see it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Ib, and you're right that they are a minority in Israel. The vast majority of Israeli Jews are secular. They're not right-wing, they're not Orthodox, and yet these people wield a disproportionate amount of political power in the state of Israel. I think it's also important to note that in Jewish consciousness, and I'm wanting to back up a little bit because I don't, in Jewish consciousness, I don't think you can separate the creation of the state of Israel from the Holocaust. And when I was growing up, and I was, I'm 10 years your junior, but I remember I was 7 years old when during the 6-Day War, and what was underlying Zionism, which originated in Europe as a movement, was the centuries of oppression that Jews experienced under Europe and European colonialism, with the most horrific of which was the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. And the refrain was never again. And the creation of the state of Israel was presented to me as a young Jew growing up in the United States as an eternal refuge for Jews worldwide from wherever we're oppressed. And in a lot of Jewish consciousness, that's everywhere. And I was raised that even in the United States, as good as we have it, never think that it couldn't happen here. And so to me, the state of Israel is always represented some place where I could go that could be a safe refuge for me and for other Jews worldwide. And this was in response to European colonialism and the horrors of that. The tragic irony is that what Jews have done in the state of Israel is perpetuated that settler colonialism and oppress the Palestinian people in the name of our own safety and security. So in that sense, I think the dynamic is, the emotional dynamic is far more complex than just a classic settler colonial indigenous people type of dynamic. Would you disagree with that characterization, Ed?
No, I fully agree. I think that's a good characterization of it. I do believe that what I said about the government, although I didn't say it's a government held together with, you know, bubble gum and scotch tape, because of the nature of it. It is a government of coalitions, and therefore the settlers have a huge voice. They run the government, basically, whether we like it or not, whether secular Jews like it or not. So they end up making terrible laws, discriminatory laws, apartheid-like laws, oppressive laws. And to me, that's not the nature of the Jew that I respect and love. The nature of the Jew that I respect and love is a just Jew, one who wants to see justice for themselves, for their people, and other people. And equally important, to see it for other people. I am also a fan of anybody, whether they're, regardless of their race or nationality, who follows that particular philosophy of justice. As Martin Luther King says, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And unless we believe that, and I do believe our forefathers were prophets of God that came and preached justice and equality and love of God and love of mercy. And I don't see mercy and I don't see justice there. And without those elements, we cannot have peace. And so pounding each other with rockets or pounding each other with air raids or from the Navy and the ground, that is crazy. That is the definition of insanity. And we continue to do that time and time and time again, hoping for different results. That, again, is the classic definition of insanity. And we find ourselves, brilliant as we may be, or we may claim to be as people of, and holy as we may claim to be, people of the book, okay? Yet we are stupid as you can imagine by repeating our same methodology of trying to solve our issues, hoping that, or hoping and praying, and I put that between brackets, between quotes, that some different magical stuff will happen.
Yeah.
No, what will happen is there'll be more orphans, more mothers crying over their kids. That is a tragedy. We cannot continue the pursuit of peace by killing one another. That's a dead end. And I don't mean that as a pun.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Ed. I mean, growing up, one of the most basic precepts of Jewish values is that you treat the stranger who lives in your land as one of your native born. And after centuries of being the other people in wherever country that Jews have lived in the diaspora, and even in our biblical stories going back to being slaves in Egypt, that one of the most basic precepts is that you treat the foreigner who lives in your land as one of your native born people. And it gets back to that tragic irony that in what is a so-called Jewish state, that that the state of Israel is violating one of the most basic precepts and values, core values of Judaism, which is around fairness and justice and equality.
I agree with you. I think there is a colossal failure in that department, and therefore, hence the bumps in the road that have become the elephants in the room. We cannot solve our problems by oppressing one another. That message should be loud and clear to the leaders of Israel, to the leaders of the settlers, that as you well know, Israel is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, nation in the Middle East from the military standpoint. I am not sure it has garnered the strength in the Department of Wisdom whatsoever, because it is failing. It is thinking that it can force the time and destiny by using its military strength. And it scares the GBs out of me because it also has nuclear weapons. And I see the biblical predictions hovering around the horizon, and that's not palatable. Yeah. Oppression is wrong in anybody's book, and it should be wrong in the Israeli book. Okay, and I know it is wrong in the Jewish book.
Yeah.
So for those people that claim to be God's people, well, why don't you start by implementing some of God's commandments, such as justice, such as fairness, such as mercy, such as love? That's my question.
Yeah, well, when he was Secretary of State, John Kerry said that Israel can be a Jewish state or it can be a democratic state, but it can't be both. And my argument is that Israel is even failing at being a Jewish state.
I agree.
In that it just is ignoring some of the basic values, core values of Judaism. I think it's true that in some respects, Israel is the most democratic, is among the most democratic states in the region, and yet how do you square that with it essentially being an apartheid regime that is oppressing a large share of the population that's under its control? And you can't.
I don't know
square that.
Yeah, I don't know how the case of having your cake and eating it too has never been accomplished by anybody, and I doubt that Israel can do it, or anybody for that matter, because injustice is the antithesis, is the opposite of justice, and any way you slice it, it's going to come out that way.
It seems to me that under President Clinton, Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat were pretty close to making peace. And I remember the meeting in Camp David. What are the obstacles to peace right now? I think in Israel, Hamas is being seen as the obstacle, and in Palestine, it's probably the settlers that is taking over territories, pushing. How could peace happen with the settlers on one side and Hamas on the other side?
Well, I think that for decades, the main issues have been around the status of Jerusalem and around the Palestinian right of return. That, as it mentioned today, is al-Nakba.
Daniel, to that point, you talked about the Palestinian right to return, so it's probably good to mention that You have Palestinian refugees in Jordan, right?
Mhm.
So for people to
In
understand,
many Arab countries.
yeah,
Mm,
for people to understand what you're talking about
mm,
Palestinian refugees.
Yeah, and so as he mentioned in 1948, uh, um, many Palestinians were dispossessed of their land in the name of creating the state of Israel, and were forcibly removed, and so uh, there needs to be a way to reconcile that injustice, which I think is one of the core injustices um, of um, of the creation of the state of Israel, which is commemorated today as Al Nakba, and the um, and um, and so now, several decades later, you have essentially Jews and Palestinians who are claiming the same lands, the same home, the same properties as their own, and somehow that needs to be reconciled, I think, before you can have true peace.
I agree. I think if I may read you a little bit of an article that I'm happen to be reading about the topic that sort of illuminates some of those issues that Daniel and I have been addressing. And this, so, and I'm starting to read. It says the Israeli military occupation of the remainder of the historic Palestine in 1967 necessitated from an Israeli colonial perspective, the creation of fresh laws that would allow the state and the illegal settlement uh, enterprise to claim yet more of Palestinian property. This is part of what's changed. Is facts on the ground. This took place in 1970 in the form of the Legal and Administrative Matters Law, which is on the Israeli books. So judges have to use that as in passing decisions. According to the new legal framework, only Israeli Jews were allowed to claim lost land and property in Palestinian areas. So the refugees that Ibrahim is talking about that live in Jordan or Syria or Egypt, they are not allowed to, the law of return does not apply to them. Yet any Jew in the world, including Daniel, can go and be welcomed in Israel and issued a citizenship upon arrival and helped into establishing himself as a right of return. There is a right of return for Jews, but not for Palestinians. So then there's also Administrative Matters Law and Master Plan of 2000, which is understood together as one is easily able to decipher the nature of the Israeli colonial scheme in East Jerusalem, where Israeli individuals in coordination with settler organizations who work together to fulfill the vision of the state of Israel. Okay, in their joint appeal, Palestinian human rights organizations, which we're part of one here in Eugene, describe the flow of how eviction orders issued by Israeli courts culminate into the construction of illegal Jewish settlements. Confiscated Palestinian properties are usually transferred to a branch within the Israeli Ministry of Justice called the Israeli Custodian General. The latter holds onto these properties until they are claimed by Israeli Jews in accordance with the 1970 law. Those are real things. They're not just my feelings and Daniel's feelings, which are vital and important because we are somewhat representative of our people. We're the peace seekers, that we care about one another, we care about justice, but there are some real roadblocks, as Ibrahim asked. What are the roadblocks that made the Clinton and Yasser Arafat and the Israeli leaders not accomplish peace. Well, there is an intention on skirting peace. They've been over 20 years of negotiating, if you will, and I put that between quotation marks, negotiating for peace. But there is no intention on. I believe, as a Palestinian, and that may be a skewed view, but nonetheless, I do believe that there is no intention on the Israeli government's part, excuse me, to accomplish peace, because they don't see it as peace. They see it as a deterrent to their dreams, goals, and hopes. So that is a huge obstacle, because two hands do not clap unless they mean to clap. Otherwise, they go past each other, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ib. I think that if we're talking about obstacles, you can't ignore the role of the United States in this, in enabling and supporting an oppressive apartheid regime. And I think that you also, I mean, what the Trump administration did in allowing Israel to claim more of Jerusalem, I think has it just added more fuel to the fire that was already building over decades of oppression. And now this is what we've seen explode as a result. I think you also can't ignore the role of Christian Zionism in the United States in supporting and furthering and escalating these tensions. And I think that that was probably most of what was behind the actions of the Trump administration. And let me just define Christian Zionism, that in evangelical Christian beliefs around the end times, which we've alluded to, and biblical prophecy of what happens, the creation of the state of Israel and the return of Jews worldwide to the state of Israel is a necessary prerequisite for the return, for the second coming of Jesus, according to that. And so it really is in the benefit of Christian Zionists to escalate these tensions in the Middle East, to move towards an apocalyptic end time war that will start in the land of Israel and spread to the whole world and will pave the way. I mean, I have studied a lot of these fundamentalist Christian end time prophecies, and they are absolutely frightening. They're absolutely frightening, and that they so totally believe that this is going to happen. And in their thinking, the Jews and Muslims are just pawns in this in this Christian-centered end game of humanity on Earth. That in great part has influenced the role of the United States in supporting Israel and in brokering negotiations and agreements between Israel and the Palestinians.
I agree. That's another cog in the wheel that I am sure that if you didn't bring up, I would have. But I'm so glad that you articulated that so well, because it is real also.
Okay. So it appears that watching the news the last few days, that the conflict, part of the conflict, is now happening in Israel. Arabs in Israel, as some of them are being lynched. So seeing the communities kind of getting involved. And to what I hear, it's like it wasn't like that in the past. while the Arabs living in Israel were targeted and hurt by a part of the maybe the settlers or at least extremist Israelis. So, uh, can we expect that to get worse, or is it a way for Israel government to stop that?
I do not believe that the Israeli government has any intention of stopping that and is capable of stopping it, because again, the tail that wags the dog is the settler movement, which they don't have any intentions. They are in collusion, in a sense, with the uh, uh, Christian Zionism that uh, uh, Daniel has just explained, in the sense that they think that in the end of time, it will be rapture of the Jews, not the Gentiles, not the Christians. So from that standpoint, it is a dead end. It's frightening, as also was mentioned by Daniel. I do believe that the law of diminishing returns has caught up with Israel, in the sense that even the Arabs and Palestinians in Israel from 1948 are seeing clearly the injustice that's happening to their brothers under the occupation, and they no longer can sit and ignore it and look the other way. They therefore have to stand with justice and stand with reason and stand with mercy and stand with the principles that their religion and their culture and the all of those holy prophets that came to that area have preached. They preached justice and mercy and love and care. Uh, and they see the Israeli government and their intentions are totally, let's just beat them up harder. Let's make their ancestors regret that they were born. That philosophy of David and Goliath, now it's been reversed. I have never seen in the 50 plus years that I've been in this country a Jewish organization that is originated in and lives in this country, in the US, advocating to Biden to be just and to condemn Israel's actions. And it's J Street, a basically middle of the line Jewish organizations, not Jewish Voice for Peace, for instance, which I'm sure they may have advocated the same thing. But when moral Jews stand up and say enough is enough, wrong is wrong, there's a correction is about to happen, and I pray to God that correction must happen, and hopefully will happen.
Yeah, and I mean the truth is, the majority of American Jews support the J Street position far more than the AIPAC position. AIPAC being the organization that is more right-wing Zionist in the United States.
Okay. So, when you talk about Israel and Palestine, for people who are not from the region or who are not Jews, it is that some of them are very cautious, because when you speak on the issue and you seem to be supporting or at least asking for more justice for Palestinians, sometimes you're being seen as anti-Semitic. What is the link between? Yeah. Is it a design that way to make people uncomfortable, or
I don't know if it's designed that way, Ibrahim, but this comes out of that same consciousness that comes out of the Holocaust that I mentioned, and the centuries of anti-Semitic violence and oppression that Jews have experienced. And that's why the state of Israel, which is so enmeshed in Jewish consciousness as the antidote of the Holocaust. In Hebrew school growing up, we'd learn about the Holocaust, and it always ended up with the creation of the state of Israel, as this will never happen again because we have a place of our own now. And so when you attack the Israeli government for its oppressive policies, when you criticize Israel, and then this is perpetuated by the Christian Zionists that we talked about earlier, that, oh, you are anti-Jewish if you criticize the state of Israel. And that has to end. That has to end. Jews have to realize that if we can create a land where Jews and Arabs and everyone can live together and at peace, that will do more for our security as Jews than continuing this unsustainable apartheid regime.
I fully agree. I think anti-Semitism is real. There is no doubt about it. And I will fight against it in any way that I can that is real. Yet I do believe what Daniel has said is crucial. You know, we in this country can criticize this government, the United States government, but there are 28 states that adopted laws in the United States of America that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. I mean, really, how can you? Yeah, being against Israel is anti-Semitic, but criticizing its occupational policies and its injustices and its stupidity is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and I would put forth that those laws in those states were not put forward by Jews. They were put forward by these Christian Zionists, who I link with other right wing and white supremacist groups in the United States, such as Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Patriot Prayer, and that, you know, I think that at its core, Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic itself.
I fully agree. It's a roundabout way of coming around to that definition, but it is crucial to see that if we can criticize our government, if we can criticize ourselves when we do wrong, why can we not criticize anybody else, especially if it's constructive criticism? If it has merit, it will, you know, it'll be a prima facie case. It'll stand on its own 2 feet. If it doesn't, then we will show ourselves as ignorant by bringing those topics up. So how can you, freedom of speech is vital to democracy. And like Daniel said, Israel can, he was quoting Kerry, the ex-Secretary of State, as saying Israel can be democratic or Jewish, but can be both. And I agree that the essence of democracy is that we can speak out. Freedom of speech is part of the essence of democracy. If we cancel that, if we work against it, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, and there's a question. I think Daniel touched part of it is if there was any comparison that could be made between the settlers in Israel and Palestine and the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers here, knowing that white supremacy, white nationalism, is all about power taking over the land.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's the idea that that in the minds of a lot of these right-wing Jewish settlers, that the Palestinians that they're displacing are somehow less than fully human.
They're children of a lesser God, to put it mildly. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're the grass under the elephant's feet, and so be it. Um, they're dispensable.
Yeah, and I mean, and their goal has always been a unified Jerusalem and a unified Israel. But I think the reality is that we will not have a unified Jerusalem unless it is as the capital of a single binational state.
Jerusalem is supposed to be the city of peace and can't have peace if there's injustice. It's simply incompatible.
Yeah.
And it's the, like you said, it's not on a trade route. It doesn't have waterways around it, but yet it's the most conquered city on earth. Okay, so for obvious reasons, for its religious value and emotional value. So we cannot accept religion and emotions if they are devoid of justice. It's simply incompatible. It can't happen. I mean, when are we going to wake up to that reality that justice for Jews that is a fallacy, is a stupid thing, unless it's just like all lives matter. Well, only if Black lives matter, all lives matter. Yes. And the same, only if justice for other folks can be included in justice for the Jews, can that equation be accurate and be sustainable and be supportable. And so, excuse me, but if I am a child of a lesser God, I may feel slighted.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a question to Eve. What travel document a Palestinian would use nowadays?
Right now, there are Israeli IDs. I had an Israeli ID that I was counted as a person who was there when the war broke out in 1967. And I also have a Jordanian passport, and I have an American passport, and I also traveled on a international laissez-passer. So it was a conglomerate of IDs, none of which said I was Palestinian. So it's a sad statement of affairs that I have 4 IDs, none of which describe how where I came from in terms of nationality. So and Palestinians now, they may have Palestinian passports that some nations in the world will accept, and some nations don't accept. So because Palestine is non-existent in some people's minds, and it's not really an area. So if I address a letter to my family, Bethlehem occupied Palestine, it may or may not get there. If I say Bethlehem, Israel, it most likely will get there. It's crazy. It's a crazy situation. It's unsustainable.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, and probably my last question, and I will ask you to also close on that. What us here as human rights activists, what could be done to kind of bring more attention of the American government to be more involved in a good way, resolving the problem and bringing peace to the Middle East?
Daniel, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is just to write our representatives in Washington, D.C., the Biden administration, and let them know that that we do not support the status quo, that we, and press them, because really the United States is in a unique position to be able to influence what the Israeli government does, and to let them know that we do not support this continued occupation and these human rights violations that the Israeli government is inflicting on the Palestinian people.
I fully agree with that statement. I would add to it that on a personal level, that we initiate the idea of of Martin Luther King saying injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And for us to believe in justice as a core value in the pursuit of peace. When I speak about the topic, when I have spoken about the topic previously, I made sure that my listeners, those that were taking my words into their minds and mulling them around, remembered that I wish you not to be pro-Palestinian. I wish you not to be pro-Israel. I wish you to be pro-justice. Wherever justice lies, follow it, because you can defend your position. And more importantly, you can sleep well that evening. Okay. So again, I will reiterate that don't be pro-Palestinian, don't be pro-Israel, be pro-justice. Yeah. And fight against oppression. And thank you, Daniel. That was powerful to remind people that we do have a voice. We can speak out. We can write our senators. We can write our congressmen. We all have to unite towards the goal of justice, because that's how peace can come about.
Yeah, and personally, I might be in the minority, but I think the only long-term sustainable solution is a single binational state, in which there is full right of return for Palestinians and Jews, that it's built into its constitution, that it's a safe sanctuary for all religious refugees, and to have full equal rights for all. And yeah, it certainly would be no small feat to get from here to there. I think it would require a South African like truth and reconciliation process. There's more than enough human rights abuses and atrocities on both sides to fill up volumes, and yet at some point we need to put the anger, we need to put the fear, we need to put the mistrust, we need to put the hurt behind us and move forward into so that we can all be in a better place. I mean, yeah, the potential gains of that to me are incredible. Yeah, the resources of the land, the human resource, the education, the brain power that exists among all the peoples there could make that that little slice of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean an economic powerhouse for the entire region, if we can just not be at each other's throats.
In conclusion, I would say amen to everything that Daniel just said.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Eve. I also just realized that there were some comments on Facebook, because for now I'm a one-man team, so I don't have someone monitoring the chat on Facebook. I promise that as we move forward with this series of conversation. I want to let people know that Human Stories will have continued conversation around issues that matter to the community. We're trying to design a form and make it a regular weekly meeting. And the name is more likely to be Agora, Agora being the place where in the mythology people used to gather at night after dinner to talk about the issues in the community. So thank you to both of you. Thanks for taking the time this Saturday to be here. Thanks to all the people who were attendees and all the people on Facebook. Stay
And,
tuned. We will try to have more conversation going.
and thank you, Ibrahim, for initiating this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And always a pleasure talking with you, Ib.
Thank you very much. You have a good day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.